Thank you for joining us this morning. It's a public holiday in Singapore here, so I really appreciate your enthusiasm on a Saturday morning. It's a pleasure to welcome you back for the second day of the Symposium, City of Others, City of Migrants, Art in Paris, 1920s to the 40s. I'm Adele Tan, if you don't know me already. I'm Senior Curator and Assistant Director of curatorial programs here at the National Gallery, and I will be your host for today. Yesterday, we began the symposium with a very compelling and evocative keynote lecture by Dr. Denise Murrell from the Met, who traced the cultural crosscurrents of the Harlem Renaissance and its relationship with Paris. Today, we shift our focus towards Asian artists and their experiences in interwar Paris. Through a rich lineup of lectures, presentations, and discussions, we will explore how these artists navigated migration, forged transnational networks, and contributed to the artistic life of the city of Paris. Our day is structured into two sessions. This morning, you will hear from our curatorial team, Dr. Phoebe Scott, Teo Hui Min, and Roy Ng, who will share insights from the exhibition's research. This will be followed by a lunch break, which is provided for you all at the auditorium foyer. And after lunch, we will welcome two distinguished keynote speakers, Professor Inaga Shigemi and Dr. Eric Lefebvre, who will expand the conversation with fresh perspectives on Asian art and diaspora in Paris. And we will conclude the symposium with a curatorial roundtable featuring the exhibition team, Dr. Cai Heng, Horikawa Lisa, Roy Ng, Teo Hui Min, and Dr. Phoebe Scott, who is the lead curator of the exhibition. And this will be moderated by Dr. Patrick Flores, our chief curator. This conversation will bring together reflections on Paris as City of Others from various curatorial perspectives. But first, I'm delighted to introduce our first speaker today, Dr. Phoebe Scott, who will be delivering the introductory keynote. Phoebe is Senior Curator and Curator of Research Publications here at the Gallery, and the lead curator, as I've mentioned, of this exhibition, City of Others, Asian Artists in Paris. Her past exhibitions include Radiant Material, a dialogue in Vietnamese lacquer painting in 2017, Reframing Modernism in 2016, and the long running Between Declarations and Dreams, Art of Southeast Asia since the 19th century. Her research focuses on global modernisms, colonial histories, and the evolution of art in Vietnam and Southeast Asia. She holds a PhD from the University of Sydney and also teaches courses at the National University of Singapore. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Phoebe Scott, who opens the day with her lecture, Paris as a City of Others, Discourses of the French and Foreign in Interwar Art. Phoebe, please.
Hello, good morning, everybody. Such a delight to see you all today, and thank you for giving up your Saturday morning in bed to be with us. Before I launch into the lecture proper, I do want to acknowledge that much of what I'm sharing today is also a synthesis of research developed by the whole of the curatorial team for City of Others. So Horikawa Lisa, Cai Heng, Roy Ng, Teo Hui Min, and myself. My lecture this morning concerns the central thesis of the City of Others exhibition as expressed by its title. While this exhibition title makes reference to the diversity and plurality of people and art in Paris, you might notice that it doesn't contain any words like cosmopolitan, international, or global, but instead conveys the idea of otherness, something which might connote strangeness, estrangement, difference, as well as exoticism. If the sense of a city suggests a shared space and introduces the possibilities of proximity and common experience, the idea of the other can perhaps suggest the tensions or even limits of this same experience. The dynamic of the City of Others seems well captured by this remarkable work by the Chinese modernist Pan Yuliang, painted in Paris in 1940. Where four men, perhaps intended to represent four different parts of the world, are clustered together in a proximate space. But the work is no heavy-handed or exotic racial allegory. All four of the men are contemporary, composed, even professional. Yet despite the title of friendship, they avoid one another's eyes. We can sense in this painting both a moment of amazing potential as well as of tension. For artists and for art history, this dynamic of self and other is not just a personal or biographical experience, but one that's expressed by works of art and mediated by how works of art are circulated and received. In interwar Paris, certain ideas about otherness were already ingrained in the discourse of art, and artists coming to Paris from elsewhere necessarily encountered these ideas and preconceptions. This lecture will introduce how ideas of the French and the foreign were especially loaded in the modernism of Paris in this period. Drawing on research conducted for the exhibition and prior, I will highlight how the interactions of Asian artists with three areas of modern art that were quite distinctive in the interwar years. Firstly, Art Deco. Second, the network of Art Colonial. And third, the aesthetics of the return to order. These three areas are of particular interest. First, because all three dealt in some way with ideas of foreignness versus Frenchness in this period. Second, because they all represented quite concentrated zones of activity for artists from Asia who came to Paris. And finally, much like other aspects of Asian modernisms, these parts of the art world in Paris have also been relatively marginal in the art history of modernism, not forming much of the story of what has conventionally been emphasized art historically in this period. By looking at these areas, we not only have a clearer picture of what Asian artists were doing in Paris, but also a clearer picture of the diversity and expanse of modernism itself. Artists arriving in Paris from Asia in this period encountered a growing migrant community of considerable diversity. Following World War I, according to the art historian Christopher Green, the foreign residents of Paris grew from 5.3% of the population in 1921 to 9.2% in 1931. And in fact, this figure was only foreign citizens, so it excluded the many people from elsewhere in the world who are actually members of the colonized French Empire. While the period represents a surge in the presence of Asian migrants in Paris, the distribution of artists from the region was quite uneven. The largest group of artists from Asia active in Paris came from Japan, and close to 200 Japanese artists resided there by the late 1920s. And I must say the difficulty in collecting these figures means that there's extraordinary variation in the statistics of who was there and in what numbers. The arrival of Chinese artists in Paris also increased significantly after World War I, largely as a result of programs developed in the reformist culture of Republican-era China. Meanwhile, Vietnamese artists had an unusual prominence despite their relatively small numbers in the city of Paris, as their work was circulated and sold via networks intended to promote French colonialism. Artists also arrived from India and other parts of Southeast Asia. However, it wasn't until the post-war period that this part of the world was represented in Paris in greater numbers. These artists joined established communities of foreign artists coming from other parts of the world, especially from the earlier part of the 20th century, Eastern Europe and North and South America. The situation was such that the Japanese artist Sugihara Fujita, who had arrived in Paris in 1913, could write in the 1920s of Montparnasse that such a community is not composed solely of Parisians, and indeed one can find people of over 50 nationalities, including those from countries so obscure their names are barely known. It is no wonder that this environment fosters unconventional ideas and creativity. Artists arriving from Asia in Paris not only experienced the othering effects of making their way in a new city and culture, but also encountered other migrant populations who were equally unfamiliar to them, with France and with each other. In this environment, difference was often brought into sharp relief, and culture was newly relativized. For some artists, it became the occasion for rediscovering the cultures of their country of origin. Thus, an artist like Amrita Shergill, in Paris between 1929 and 1934, where she had studied along predominantly academic lines, wrote to her parents in 1934 of her desire to return to India. Our long stay in Europe has aided me to discover, as it were, India. modern art has led me to the comprehension and appreciation of Indian painting and sculpture. In short, I now wish to go back to appreciate India at its worth. And it's notable that this sense of discovery was mediated through, in her words, the experience of the encounter with modern art. In addition, an interest in the other, especially via the aesthetics of art from Asia, Africa, or the Pacific, was already well integrated into modern art in Paris by this period, especially via the discourse of so-called primitivism, which was informing the development of movements like Cubism or Surrealism. For migrant artists encountering these movements, the effect could be a curious kind of refraction of seeing themselves or their cultures through the gaze of the other, while simultaneously being perceived as other themselves. And I might mention in passing that this experience was not unique to Asian artists. The Brazilian artist Docila do Amaral, in Paris in 1923, wrote home that in Paris she, quote, felt more Brazilian every day. And it was also in Paris that she created her manifesto work, A Negra, a work that represented a powerful statement of her embrace of Afro-Brazilian culture. Meanwhile, the Cuban artist Wilfredo Lam, in Paris from 1938 to 1940, was surprised to discover via Picasso in his circle that African art, with which Lam had had no previous familiarity, was considered his to explore. Yet, as Corbina Mercer has argued, Lam's encounter with both modernist primitivism and the collections of African art in Paris did cause him to reevaluate Afro-Cuban culture on his subsequent return to Cuba. And as Lam's later reflection on Paris demonstrates, the experience of this refracted gaze could also introduce a critical stance. Lam later commented, "It irritated me that in Paris African masks and idols were sold like jewelry. My painting is an act of decolonization, not in a physical sense, but in a mental one." The sense of a refracted gaze was also especially affected those who saw Paris as a proving ground for the art of their home country. And here we can refer to the interesting case of the artist Hamanaka Katsu, who, after arriving in Paris in 1924, developed a practice in lacquer, a medium in which he had never worked before. While what he made was closely connected to the fashion in Paris for decorative art and furniture made with lacquer, his ideas about the medium were also directed back to the evolving field of modern lacquer in Japan, for which purpose he wrote this Japanese language text. My hope is that in speaking as a resident of Paris, I can offer even a small reference for those who share the goal of advancing Japanese lacquer art on the world stage. To overcome the current stagnation in lacquerware for export, we must abandon the attitudes we have adhered to thus far, tear it all up by the roots and start over. The era of simply introducing things Japanese is over. We must create products that fit into European lifestyles, items that fulfill practical needs rather than being exotic curiosities. He also emphasized the need for modernity and change, rejecting overtly Orientalist stereotypes and aesthetics. Avoid cheap, predictable maquillade decorations featuring little birds on cherry blossoms, as if nothing has changed for 100 years. And this was reflected in his own visual choices, which we can see in the range of his works in the exhibition, which avoided both a reductive Orientalism as well as the direct imitation of European models. This experience of self-othering or reflexivity in Paris was taking place in an artistic environment where ideas of the exotic, the foreign, and the French were increasingly loaded. This mapping shows 3 areas of interwar modernism, all of which had an important relationship to these debates. And all 3 were also areas of concentration for artists from Asia working in interwar Paris, among other artists. Of course, in emphasizing these features of the Paris art world, it's important to express that these are by no means the only factors in the artists' trajectories. And in fact, all of the artists in the exhibition, whether they became permanent migrants or whether Paris was merely a period in their careers, moved in and out of equally complex modernities unfolding in Asia. And I would like to express that I think the City of Others exhibition as it stands could perhaps only have been presented in its current form in the context of a museum like National Gallery Singapore, which dedicates its 2 major permanent galleries specifically to the modernities of this region. In mapping Asian presence in precise zones of the Paris art world, the aspiration is to gain some precision about what exactly artists brought to this setting, what they took away from it, and how their work was received while they were there. And it also can allow us to unsettle some of our assumptions about what the function of Paris was for these artists. First, Art Deco. An aesthetic in the domain of decorative arts in which a new style, streamlined, modern, popular, became widespread after the landmark major exhibition in Paris, the International Exhibition of Modern Industrial and Decorative Arts in 1925, from which the term Art Deco actually comes. Art Deco was an adaptive style, appropriating from modernist art movements like Cubism and Surrealism, but in an untheorized and accessible manner. It was also wildly appropriative from materials and aesthetics from across the world, from China and Japan to ancient Egypt to the domains of the French Empire. It was an area in which the circulation of an image of exoticism and the exotic other was particularly conspicuous. In terms of the sites it covered, there were dedicated salons and exhibiting societies which focused on the decorative arts. It had an association with certain world expositions. It was made in workshops and businesses as well as in artist studios, and it appeared in public buildings as well as in the private commissions of the elite. And if we return to the origins of the style in the International Exhibition of Modern Decorative and Industrial Arts, it's striking to discover that a modern Asian presence was already there at the exposition where the style was first generated, in the national pavilions for China and Japan, and in a slightly different case, a colonial form of a pavilion which represented the work of Vietnamese artisans. We can also consider certain microsites within the history of Art Deco as case studies for how this style combined a fantasy of the exotic other, often in its most exaggerated and outrageous forms, with actual encounters with artists and workers from the diverse migrant communities of Paris. One such microsite is the atelier of Jean Dunant, a Swiss-born artist and designer who became the preeminent producer of lacquer in 1920s to 1930s Paris. Dunant had originally trained in sculpture and specialized in denonderie, decorative metalworking, but later his atelier became well known for large-scale, experimental and varied treatments in lacquer and a variety of different types of wares. The scale of what his atelier was able to produce is evident here in this immense 12-panel screen which we're showing in the exhibition, as well as in the archival image, which shows the immense lacquered panels that Dunant's studio made to decorate the interiors of luxury passenger ships. His atelier had to be reorganized to accommodate the immense scale of this work, and at its height, the studio employed 100 workers. In 1912, Dunant had learnt the rudiments of lacquer technique from the Japanese artist Sugawara Seizo. Sugawara, trained in Japan, had come to Paris initially to work for the atelier of the jeweler Lucien Gaillard, but had subsequently formed a deeper creative and business partnership with the Irish designer Eileen Gray. The two joined forces in 1910 and had a productive business until 1927. And this is an image from the work in the exhibition which they made together for the Paris residence of the fashion designer Jacques Doucet. But while Sugawara is often credited with Dunant's initial education in lacquer, the two did not collaborate in any extensive fashion. And in fact, Dunant's lacquer production did not increase until after World War I, when he began to show more ambitious lacquer works in his salon and gallery presentations, a moment which also coincided with the expansion of his Vietnamese workforce. What we know of this workforce exists only in quite limited traces. Dunant first started working with Vietnamese lacquerers during World War I, when they were recruited to trial industrial uses of lacquer for combat airplanes during the war, applying the lacquer to airplane propellers to make them more weather-resistant and impermeable. Subsequently, Vietnamese artisans worked directly in Dunant's atelier. And you can see here some archival images of different workers in this atelier using the technique of applying eggshell inlay to the lacquer surface. Villages in the northern areas of Vietnam and in the environs of Hanoi were dedicated to an array of specialized skills that supported the production of lacquer. Thus, the artisans who worked on the eggshell inlay in Dunant's atelier were perhaps initially trained on the inlayer of mother-of-pearl inlaid furniture, for which North Vietnam was well known, and then subsequently used this to create the geometric displays of eggshell inlay work that became one of the signature techniques of the Dunant Maison. And I extract this quotation here about someone's visit to the Dunant atelier observing these workers. And the reason it's necessary to frame the workers in this way is that it's only by these kind of incidental accounts of the atelier that we really find out about their presence there, what exactly they were doing and who they were. Whereas in the exhibition, we also have some archival materials that uncovers their names, which is not from any art historical source, but actually from an incidental kind of surveillance report about leftist activity in Paris, which happens to include documentation of the community of lacquer workers. Adding a further dimension to this atelier's engagement is the presence of the Javanese artist, designer, and modern dancer Raden Mas Yojana within Dunant's atelier. Yojana grew up in the courtly milieu of Yogyakarta, where he initially learnt Javanese dance. Moving to the Netherlands for his studies in 1914, he began to dance professionally, as well as becoming involved with the visual arts, and he learnt printmaking with some Dutch artists of the Art Nouveau style, such as Chris Lebeau. Yojana's talent attracted the attention of Jean Dunant, who invited him to Paris to work in his atelier in the early 1920s. The dance scholar Matthew Cohen has speculated that certain works by Dunant, notably this one of Oriental dances, may actually have been designed by Yojana. But this is very difficult to confirm, because in fact Dunant's work as a whole, like other parts of Art Deco, appropriated very widely from many different kinds of source. And unfortunately, no real records remain about what precisely Yojana might have designed. But certainly, Dunant has a series of works in this period, with figures with refined, elongated limbs, dancer figures with elaborate headdresses, fields of geometric painting, all of which could be references to Javanese dance or aesthetics. Some interesting traces do confirm the presence of Yojana in Dunant's studio, but as a dancer. And this account reads, certain evenings in an atelier of an artist of great metal vases, this is almost certainly Dunant because he was very famous for making large vases, sometimes dancers for a refined audience are certain Raden Mas Yojana, Javanese prince if you please, who is like an ivory animated by the rhythms of the sacred Buddhist dance. It is a rare spectacle where snobbery might appeal to some, but where the spiritual and aesthetic emotion is sure to make others return. So once again, many layers of the refracted gaze and exoticism in a single statement. But interestingly, in Paris at Dunant's studio, Yojana met the experimental theatre actors and directors Charles Dulin and Jacques Coupeau, who introduced him to the circle of the Théâtre du Vieux Colombier, an experimental space where Yojana later performed and developed some of his repertoire in modern Javanese dance. Finally, we might consider the layer of Dunant's collaborations with the African-American dancer Josephine Baker, an icon of Jazz Age Paris, who at the height of her career in Paris in the 1920s, in fact became the highest paid entertainer in the whole of Europe. Her routines combined a thorough knowledge of jazz and vaudeville choreography with a tongue-in-cheek rendering of supposedly African dance, reinforced by her costuming and frequently her partly clothed body on stage. Dunant's studio made jewelry for Baker, including this large lacquered cuff bracelet, which we're showing in the exhibition, and he also made portraits of her, including this evocative version, Josephine Veiled. In this one image, many different refracted gazes converge. The image of Josephine with her famous body partially visible through the wisp of curtain here repeats a stereotype of sexuality that in French popular culture was associated with Africa, a place that Baker herself had never been. Her image in the painting floats on a field of golden lacquer, a material that Dunant could only access relatively cheaply and easily because of the colonization of French Indochina, from where the material was exported. It may then have been worked in his atelier by skilled artisans also from Vietnam, using techniques that they had brought to Paris, or those newly invented in the atelier, or those transmitted to Dunant by Sugawara, who was himself invited to Paris because of an earlier wave of modern fascination with the exotic, namely Japonism. And from this layering of refractions of self and other, an image emerged which, through its markers of form and material, appealed to an elite Paris clientele as an expression of their own taste and modernity. The issue of Dunant's Vietnamese workers reinforces a larger point, namely the intimate connection between Art Deco and the French Empire. While Art Deco's exoticism in terms of forms and materials has been well noted, perhaps further sustained attention could be paid to how the labor which produced it was also implicated in networks of colonization. This begins to emerge more clearly if we consider the field of interwar art known as art colonial, meaning art related specifically to the French colonies. As the art historians Dominique Jaracet and Laurent Housset have argued, art colonial became a distinctive field in the interwar period, with dedicated societies, magazines, and salons. This infrastructure formed a kind of parallel art economy, with prizes, appointments, and special commissions linking together the art worlds of France and its colonies. The significance of these links increased after World War I, as the colonies came to be seen as an integral part of national identity, developing a new discourse of Greater France. And of course, this concept of Greater France addressed neither the huge disparity in rights and freedoms between the peoples of France and its colonies, nor the conditions of violence, exploitation, disempowerment, and racial hierarchy under which the colonized populations continued to suffer. As a demonstration of this public discourse in visual terms and of the aesthetic link between Art Colonial and Art Deco, we can consider the Palais de la Porte Dorée. This building was constructed for the International Colonial Exposition of 1931, a huge World's Fair type exposition held on the outskirts of Paris, in which various European powers showcased their colonies in immense reconstructions of Asian, African, or Oceanic architecture. The Palais de la Porte Dorée, by contrast, was one of the few permanent structures intended to remain standing after the exposition. And in fact, it still stands in Paris today. It now houses the Museum of Immigration. Considered a major landmark of Art Deco architecture, it also communicates colonial propaganda directly within Art Deco forms. And interestingly, we can notice Jean Dunant's presence here as well. So he was responsible for designing an entire lacquer salon in the building with images of peoples of the world and flora and fauna of the 4 continents. Aside from major public commissions, artists associated with the colonies could also exhibit at dedicated platforms in Paris, notably the Société Coloniale des Artistes Français, active from 1908. This society awarded scholarships and prizes for travel to the colonies, such as the Indochina Prize, which gave the artist 2 years in Indochina, including a teaching period at the École des Beaux-Arts in Hanoi. The sculptor Évariste Jonchère is a very interesting example of how artists could move through this system, not only between the colonies and the metropole, but laterally between different French colonies as well. Jonchère was a talented sculptor who won the Indochina Prize in 1932. And during his travels in Laos, he met the royal family there, which is when he developed this sculpture of a young Laotian princess. This sculpture, along with another work shown here, which Jonchère made in Paris, of the mixed-race Martinican dancer Dalal, was shown in a major survey of Jonchère's work at the Colonial Society in 1935. In 1938, Jonchère took up the post as the second director of the Indochina School of Fine Arts in Hanoi, reorganizing the curriculum to focus more on artisanal work, a move which caused some protest and consternation among Vietnamese students. Forced to leave Vietnam because of the outbreak of the First Indochina War in 1946, Jonchère subsequently also became director of the Academy of Art in Brazzaville, which was then in French Equatorial Africa, where he lived in the early 1950s. So you can see this extraordinary kind of network of movement across the world that this system-enabled for French artists engaged with art colonial. This system also had the reciprocal element that works by artists from parts of the colonized world could also be sent to Paris for exhibition and sale. And one of the exhibiting venues was also the Société Coloniale des Artistes Français. So Vietnamese artists would exhibit there alongside French colonial artists. In addition to that, for Vietnamese artists, a dedicated salon for artwork from Indochina was established in 1932 as part of the Agence Économique de l'Indochine, or the Indochina Economic Agency. And here's a picture of the salon there as well. And the idea was that this salon would show the art and the artisanal products of all of the art schools from across Indochina, where it would be reviewed and sold and also make its way into other exhibiting platforms. These venues promoted the visibility of the colonial mission civilisatrice via the arts, but they had a straightforwardly economic function as well. The significance of art and visual culture in the staging of Greater France were also especially evident at the International Colonial Exposition of Paris in 1931. And to attract a public audience at this exhibition, didactic displays related to the colonies were housed in architectural settings designed to simulate local architecture. One of the highlights was the almost-to-scale reconstruction of the Khmer Temple of Angkor Wat, presented as the Palais d'Indochine and one of several buildings related to France's Indo-Chinese colonies. The reason we highlight this site in the City of Others exhibition is that a suite of rooms inside the Angkor Wat Pavilion represented the work of the newly graduated students of the School of Fine Arts in Hanoi, and it was in fact their first major international showing. It included oil paintings, paintings on silk, lacquer panels, decorative art, as well as a huge bas-relief carved by Le Tien Phuc, Georges Kang, and Vu Cao Dam. Lefebvre exhibited L'Age Heureux, a subtle oil painting in harmonious tones, conjuring a wistful and even melancholic image of a happy age in the past. Of course, we cannot know today how Vietnamese artists really felt about having their work displayed within this propagandistic framework. Such things were too sensitive to be discussed openly or recorded. For Vietnamese anti-colonial activists in Paris, the exposition was certainly a moment of agitation and protest. And I think we should note that some of the artists who participated in this exposition later became part of the Vietnamese Revolution or showed their support for Ho Chi Minh during his later visits to Paris. So I don't think we can make assumptions about their politics from their participation at this moment. It also seems from the surviving evidence that the artists were determined to make the most of this setting as a public platform for their work. Lefebvre, for instance, after displaying this painting in the Indochina Pavilion, subsequently sent the work to the Salon of French Artists in 1932, where it won a silver medal. By such means, the exposition could be a launching point for a Paris-based career. Interestingly, reflecting on the moment back in Vietnam in 1945, the artist Ton Ngoc Van remarked, "In 1931, Vietnamese art graced the international audience for the first time at the Colonial Exposition in Paris. This marked its good reception abroad and subsequently inside the country." So this is an interesting example of this kind of self-reflexivity produced by the reception in Paris, where artists saw their work validated by the othering gaze of the French audience and press. Nguyen Phan Chan's work had been one of the critical successes of the exposition. His humble scenes of central Vietnam, rendered in simple tones of brown and black, were drawn from his own upbringing in that area. Following the exposition, his works were regularly sent from Hanoi to Paris to be shown at the Indochina Economic Agency. However, the director of the Indochina Agency, concerned that Chan's subtle works were perhaps not selling well enough, wrote back to Hanoi to advise, "Your paintings on silk would be much more appreciated by the French public if they were a bit less monotonous in tone." This 1933 work, painted with an uncharacteristically vibrant accent of blue, might well have been influenced by this advice. So once again, we see a very interesting feedback loop from these colonial structures and the market in Paris back to what was being produced in Hanoi. And Nguyen Phan Chan, in fact, had never traveled to Paris himself, so the platform for his work was purely through this network. Returning to this diagram, we can see how Vietnamese artists, with their training, aesthetic, and experience, could quite fluidly occupy different parts of this art world. For example, Lefebvre, who had trained in the new form of modern lacquer painting in Hanoi, debuted an early version of this type of work in Paris in 1931, which connected him to the interests of Art Deco. Meanwhile, Lefebvre was closely linked to the interest in art from the colonies and colonial imagery. But in its harmonious, semi-figurative, balanced aesthetic, the work also became connected to another discourse in interwar Paris, which was the return to order. The return to order was a tendency in interwar French art to reject avant-garde modernism and return to the revival of naturalistic painting and an interest in the classical aesthetic forms of the past. Related to this movement was a new opposition between the École Française, or French school, French modern artists perceived as working within the spirit of a French classical tradition, and the École de Paris, foreign-born migrant artists in Paris who were active in more experimental modernisms. While the artists of the École Française were also modern painters, they were associated more with academicism, ideas like harmony, restraint, and order. The École de Paris, by contrast, which was specifically associated with foreign artists, notably those clustered in the left bank enclave of Montparnasse, was more stylistically varied, but also tended to be figurative. In the increasingly polarized critical environment of the 1930s, this contrast could also have nationalistic, xenophobic, and sometimes anti-Semitic overtones. And it's interesting to see how the reception of the artists from Hanoi played into this dynamic. When assessing the work of Vietnamese artists, conservative critics in France would often use Fujita or the School of Paris as a critical foil. So for instance, in this review of an exhibition of 3 Vietnamese artists, the critic wrote, "All 3 share the common tendencies of a school where we recognize a rather disconcerting blend of Far Eastern pictorial traditions and contemporary European influences. This hybrid art cannot go very far. However, it must first be acknowledged that it possesses a merit of sincerity that is not found in the work of certain clever Japanese artists of Montparnasse." Similarly, the rabidly xenophobic right-wing critic Camille Mauclair, who actually had an extremely abusive tone of discourse against the School of Paris, was quite a fan of the Indochina School of Fine Arts artists. And he wrote, "It will perhaps become very chic to possess a Tonok Van rather than a Chagall or a Kokoschka. It will be neither more nor less euphonic, and the painting will be better." What we should note, however, is that this distinction was not necessarily meaningful for the Vietnamese artists themselves. The works that were being shown in Paris had been developed in Hanoi and related to other discourses and values in modernity. So this interpretation and classification of the works was a function of their reception environment in Paris. And as a demonstration of this, once Lefebvre migrated permanently in Paris, he also settled in the outskirts of Montparnasse, in the zone associated with the School of Paris, and some of the features of his work can be linked to those discourses too. The interconnectedness of these zones can also be seen in a case of an artist like Fujita, one of the key figures of the School of Paris and the Montparnasse community. But he also showed an engagement with Art Deco, for instance in commissioned works that he made for the apartment of Madame Juliette Levy, also famously decorated in lacquer by Sugawara Setsu and Eileen Gray. Fujita also continued to debut important works of his at the Salon d'Automne, such as My Interior Paris of 1921, showing that he was still engaged with the salon system of exhibitions. And meanwhile, of course, his infamous and beautiful nude paintings link him to the bohemian and uninhibited social circles of Montparnasse. The return to order might also be a meaningful concept for understanding the Paris period of the work of an artist like Georgette Chen. Chen, who was born in China but spent some of her early childhood years in Paris, returned in 1927 to that city, where she studied art, successfully exhibited in salon exhibitions through the 1930s, as well as having her own solo exhibition in the Rue de Seine in 1936. Art historical comparisons with Georgette's work nearly always tend to link her with post-impressionism, and especially the work of Paul Cézanne. and this is certainly apparent in a series of works she created during a trip to the south of France in 1935 with her friend and former teacher from the Académie Colarossi, Charles-Alexandre Picard-Ledoux. The link between Georgette and Cézanne has always raised the troubling spectre of belatedness, something which has often disturbed the reception of Asian modern art in general. Why, we might wonder, did Chen respond to Cézanne's work from the turn of the century or earlier, despite being in Paris in the 1920s to 1930s, where other forms of modernism were already taking centre stage? In fact, this spectre of belatedness disappears if we consider the phenomenon of the return to order, and the fact that Cézanne's classicizing form of modernism, especially in connection to the landscape, was enjoying a widespread revival and reinterpretation in interwar Paris. And here, in the work of Georgette's teacher Picard-Ledoux, we see the same elements of Cézanne's brushwork, the patches of colour which are used to denote underlying spatial structures and transitions of depth. Yet Picard's work departs from Cézanne's rigorous spatial concerns. His interest is in presenting a classicizing and representational composition while still keeping a sense of modern expression. The image itself of a rural woman set against an archaizing landscape reflects the strong interest within the return to order of reviving France's rural past as an anchor of present national identity, including in the field of modern art. This method of anchoring oneself in place using a representational style that is still visibly modern is surely one that continued to have meaning for an artist like Georgette, and even explains her consistent use of this style, which she continued to pursue even as she settled in Southeast Asia. On this analysis, Chen's work becomes not an example of a behind-time Asian modernist, but an instance of an artist immersing herself in a discourse as it was actually developing, something we can only perceive by remapping Paris to take account of streams of modernism that existed adjacent to or beyond the works of the modernist avant-garde. And I think some of these interests might also explain the prevalence of Asian modern artists exhibiting at the Salon d'Automne, one of the major salons in this period. And one of the questions that we had as we put together the exhibition was that we observed quite a high concentration of artists at this particular salon rather than others. And it could be that it's because this salon was quite open to both academic and modernist forms of representation. I think we're short on time, so I'll just skip through this quite quickly, but to say that French and foreign were also reflected in institutional forms. Two separate museums were founded in Paris in this period, the Musée de Luxembourg, which collected contemporary French art, and the Musée de Jeux de Paume, which had the task of collecting the art of contemporary foreign schools. So there was actually an institutional structure to divide what was modern French art and what was modern art from elsewhere. And Asian artists fall quite curiously within this divide. So this work by Lefebvre, which we're showing in the City of Others exhibition, was collected by the Musée de Luxembourg of contemporary French art. And interestingly, the curator, as it was becoming acquired, wrote a letter saying, yes, we'd like to acquire the work, but can we have some legal advice about whether an artist from Vietnam can actually be collected by this museum? Meanwhile, at the Jeux de Paume, the Museum of Contemporary Foreign Schools, were some landmark exhibitions of Chinese and Japanese modern art. And interestingly, as you see also in the exhibition, these exhibitions specifically focused on, in the Japanese case, Nihonga painting, and in the Chinese case, the modern ink painting. So both kind of setting aside modern Asian work in oils. So again, there's kind of expectation about what foreign modernisms are expected to look like and to be. Of course, not everybody accepted such neat binaries, and we find some inkling of this in an interesting review published by the critic Asia Rubinstein on the Korean artist Pai Eun-sung. Pai Eun-sung had settled in Paris after training and living for some years in Germany. And after showing at the Salon d'Automne, Pai held a solo exhibition at the Galerie Charpentier, reviewed by Rubinstein, who made the following comment. It's customary to attribute the source of creative works made by artists born outside the confines of Europe to a facile and somewhat confused notion of exoticism. This word should not be abused to express the odd pictorial quality of Pai Eun-sung's pictorial grammar. His passion for painting is precisely due to Europe. Along with other comments he makes in the review, we can read this as a refusal to rigidly categorize the artist, and perhaps a recognition of the rich creative potential that could take place when an artist became affiliated with multiple locations. The idea that modern artists from Asia had the capacity to make their work meaningful in multiple locations of the world, including a city like Paris with its outsized reputation for art, is a key underlying message of the City of Others exhibition. Further, as is demonstrated by this mapping, Paris was not necessarily the place where these artists learnt modernism in any straightforward or linear fashion. By understanding Paris as a field of many different types of modernisms, including these more adapted or malleable modernisms like Art Deco or the Return to Order, we can instead envisage a closer connection to the varied and malleable forms of modernism as they were developing in Asia. This allows us to see, rather than a hierarchical model of the transmission of modern art, instead a shared participation in an expansive and fluctuating field. Thank you.
Thank you, Phoebe. Please remain on stage to join me for a short Q&A. Just to get us going, I wondered if you might relate a little bit more about the Asian artist's own relationship to abstraction, because there is such a preponderance on figuration and figurative work in the exhibition, but you do signpost it somewhat in various places in the exhibition, because when you're talking about French and the foreign, there are also other non-French artists, particularly Europeans like Mondrian and Theo van Doesburg were already there in the 30s. Yeah.
So we decided, when we were preparing the exhibition, we decided to make our selections based on kind of where we perceived concentrations, like highest concentrations of activity of artists in Asia. And this is a very different model, I think, than what we would have pursued if we just kind of were trying to follow a certain set of stylistic interests or a certain kind of set of stylistic progressions. So you can see that there were already some artists from Asia who were interested in abstraction, and they appear in the exhibition as well, notably in the section that Lisa put together of some of the artists who were participating in the informal art academies of Montparnasse, such as those kind of organised by Fernand Léger. So I think, yeah, there's some artists there. But what our observation was that overwhelmingly the cases of artists that we found were still interested in different forms of figuration. And in some ways we felt like it was more important to kind of privilege that rather than just focusing on, those areas of modern art that are supposed to be the most important for this period. So it was a kind of a research-based, but in some ways also a conceptual decision that we should follow the mapping rather than imposing a kind of art historical model of what people were supposed to be focusing on at the time. Yeah. So, of course, this is not to say that there was no interest in abstract art by any artist from Asia, but it's just explaining our reasons for creating this emphasis in the exhibition.
Any evidence of any engagement with, say, geometric, very strict geometric abstraction?
Yes. So, for instance, one of the artists we feature, Sakata Kazuo, thank you. Sakata Kazuo, who was studying with Fernand Léger and also, in fact, became a kind of favorite student and substitute teacher in Léger's academy. You can see in the artwork that's featured in the exhibition, follows, quite a geometric, almost geometric organic kind of model of abstraction. Yeah.
And when you were showing the images of Radhamas Jogdana, it brought me actually back to, strangely, Rodin's, sketches of the Cambodian court dances. But this would be kind of pre-First World War, right? More than a decade before, Dunon and Radhamas Jogdana. I'm just curious also if there was any kind of impact from that Rodin moment subsequently.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we wanted to express in the exhibition is that by the time artists arrived in the 1920s and 30s, there'd already been quite extensive receptions of Asian art and Asian aesthetics in Paris. And in fact, the history of this goes back centuries. For the case of Rodin in particular, Rodin contributed to the popularization of the image of Cambodian dancers in France, and a kind of reception and circulation of the idea of Cambodian dance. And as a result, more troupes of Cambodian dancers continued to come to Paris through the 1920s and 1930s. So the troupe that we represent in the dance section of the exhibition is a kind of privately run offshoot of the Royal Ballet of Cambodia that continued to come in 1931. And artists continued to make images of them as well. But by this point, those images fit a lot more closely into art colonial or the return to order than, for instance, the kind of paradigm of Rodin's work, because at that point, Cambodia is also kind of being represented at some of these huge colonial events in interwar Paris.
And finally, this is kind of going back to your very first slide with Pan Yu Liang. I was kind of also curious and a bit struck by that image that you chose of friendship, right? Amité. And juxtaposing it to her very dramatic but also tragic life, right? Where Paris was a place for, I guess, recognition and in some ways liberation. And when she went back to China, she was kind of despised. Her past as a prostitute kind of never left her. And then subsequently she went back to Paris and then died in destitution. I wondered, as a kind of a postscript, your reflections on, where Paris is right now, or subsequently after the period of the pre-war, how Paris functioned for Asian artists after that.
Okay, so I started with that image, and we should say that where it's not clear that that's the artist's original title for the work. So it's quite likely that that's a later title. So the idea that that work represents friendship, actually that's not really borne out, I think, by the imagery of the work. Yes, Eric's shaking his head. So, and in fact, there's a lot of kind of strange crossed gazes. And to me, that work is expressing something that is sort of latent in our idea of the city of others, that there's diversity, there's kind of potential, there's a sort of proximity, but there's tensions and there's difficulties as well. So in the part of the exhibition where that work appears, that's the part of the show where we're veering towards the difficult choices that artists suddenly had to make in the environment of World War II and the decolonization movements that followed. And that affected artists from all different parts of the world. But I think for artists from Asia in particular, that idea that, there's a very powerful new impetus towards independence and decolonization in their countries of origin, which is kind of drawing them back. At the same time, many of them have established lives in France. And one of the reasons why we go from Pan Yu Liang and San Yu, who had quite difficult trajectories in their later careers in Paris, to a film by Phan Thanh Nguyen about the artist Dim Phung Thi, is because Dim Phung Thi is an artist of the kind of subsequent generation who came to Paris and is kind of more active in Paris during the post-war sort of School of Paris time. But that film contains material of kind of Dim Phung Thi's own writings and reflections, as well as some reflections by her close friends and associates that dramatize the difficulty of return. So that's something that's not really expressed by the rest of the exhibition, which is about Asian artists and their activities in Paris. But the idea that there's no friction or anxiety to come back and forth, that's not the case. Actually, like return and the sense of exile and distance, and then your reception on return as an artist, that could be very complicated, especially in the sort of Cold War era world where, certain parts of the world became less accessible to one another than they were. So I think in that sense, there's a certain type of isolation that also happened for some of those artists if they chose Paris. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Phoebe. We'll be opening the floor to questions. Gentleman over there.
The period from 1900 to 1925 can be seen to be one where there are a lot of new artistic movements in Paris. One can take account, and there are really a lot. Now, you chose this period, 1920s and 1940s, with a focus on the works of Asian artists or art students who are there. What do you think, the attraction? So when artists are there, either studying or to do their own research and doing their work, are there any particular movements, having them coming from different parts of Asia, that they found being attracted to?
I think there were a number of reasons why artists came to Paris in that period. And actually, it's not always attraction to a specific art movement that drew them there. So for some sections of the exhibition, you can see that there were particular artists or particular networks of artists who really prioritized the idea of academic training. This is the case, for instance, the Chinese artists who were influenced by Xu Beihong, who really wanted to come to receive a formal academic training that was very thorough. And they did this not because of any particular style, but because they thought that that was a very important grounding from which you could make various decisions about what kind of modern artist to be. Meanwhile, from Vietnam, artists came and from Japan, in fact, artists came who were already trained at art schools in the region, and they came to further their careers and kind of professional advancement. So they came for a concentration of exhibition opportunities, market opportunities, kind of to participate in this sort of aggregated network of opportunities. So I don't think any of these artists were kind of very specifically drawn by a single style. Once they were in Paris, they encountered an environment that they had to navigate, and they were attracted to many different types of styles that were available. And partly what I wanted to say in my presentation today is that if we open a textbook of modern art in this period, a kind of standard account, we might see certain styles that are prioritized, but they were not necessarily the styles that artists from Asia were attracted to. And one of the interesting things is that there was such a strong continued interest in figuration among the artists who came from Asia. And that wasn't necessarily reflective of what the avant-garde was focused on in Paris. So I think that's why we mapped the exhibition in such a way to kind of show that sometimes those areas of the art world responded to what the artists from Asia could bring with them, and sometimes they responded to what the artists who came from Asia were sort of specifically interested in when they got there. So it was a kind of dynamics of how to advance one's career, what sort of skills one was interested in, but also the reception and the expectations that came with being an Asian artist in Paris. So I hope that's a very complicated answer to your question, but I hope that explains, why we made some of those decisions in the exhibition, and also perhaps, some background about why artists moved in a certain direction when they were there.
Thank you. Are there any other burning questions? If not, I will be, there's one from Kanaga. We need the microphone.
Phoebe, thoughts, please, on your presentation largely focused on practice and practices, and equally largely on, and I appreciate that immensely, the reception. How might practices and the creative productions emerging from studios be measured, be gauged? And you gave extensive citations. But all of them were in situ from Paris, quite understandably. May I just widen that a little bit geographically? And could you give us some intimations of receptions in the respective locations from which these artists emerged from? There must have been interest in either directly tracking who is where, what, doing what, or communications by artists back to where they are. And you intimated to some of these. This is going to be a whole different chapter, I know. But might you just say a few phrases on this matter? Just an inkling as to the tone and the tenor of some of these receptions. For example, Amrita Shergill, when she returned, it was a different ballgame altogether. And what she started off with didn't turn out that way. 2 minutes.
I mean, I think obviously there's a sort of reception that happens in the artist's later body of work, right? Their trajectory when they return. So I think that's such a huge issue that I almost have to just say, I defer that to the Singapore and Southeast Asia permanent galleries to unfold in its complexity. But there's another very interesting question, which I think this show kind of developed a bit more specific research about, which was that as artists were in Paris, they continued to have a relationship to the art world of their country of origin, and their progress was monitored, sometimes quite closely, and they would write back about what they were doing. The example of Hamanaka Katsu, which I shared on the screen, where he's writing in Japanese back to the Japanese art world with a sort of position about, what they should be doing. And one of the slightly awkward things in encountering these bodies of text is that we really can't escape that in this period, Paris had a mental hold on these art worlds as a site of validation. And I think there's some very clear examples from Vietnam as well, the one I read from Ton Ngoc Van, but there are many more where because something is validated in Paris, it becomes much more legitimate to pursue it in Vietnam. And this could be strategic too. For instance, the Vietnamese artists at the École de Hanoi, that was a very contested school. In colonial Hanoi, there was a section of the conservative colonial press that did not believe that there should be modern artists being trained there. But when their work was very well received by the Paris audience, they were able to use this as a kind of leverage for their own position. Similarly, some of the aesthetic decisions that they made when they were well received in Paris, they will kind of double down on that direction. So it's not uncritical, it can be strategic, but in some ways it does kind of reinforce the idea that, we try so hard to move beyond of, the authority in some ways of Paris as a site. And no matter what we think of that idea, it was certainly something that had been internalized by many artists who were kind of coming back and forth from there at the time.
Okay, I've been commanded. Thank you, Phoebe and Kanaga, for your question. I've been commanded to move on, so please join me in giving Phoebe a round of applause. And I think that point on foreign validation as leverage is still with us in the contemporary times. Yes. So to move quickly along to the heart of this morning's session with two research presentations from the exhibition curatorial team. These talks will take us deeper into the exhibition's core themes, tracing the lives and practices of Asian artists navigating the Parisian art world in the interwar years. And first, we will hear from Teo Hui Min, whose presentation is titled Mapping Paris Sites of Practice for the Asian Artist. Hui Min will explore how Paris in the 1920s and 40s shaped the development and visibility of Asian artists by focusing on key urban spaces, studios, schools, galleries, and museums. And she'll examine how these sites acted as both platforms for artistic expression and gatekeepers to legitimacy, revealing how the city was an active agent in the artist's journey. Hui Min is a curator at the gallery and worked on long-term exhibitions such as Singapore Stories. The full exhibition will open in July this year. And Beyond Declarations and Dreams, Art of Southeast Asia since the 19th century. Her research spans visual art practices in Singapore from the 1950s to 1980s, and she has co-curated a number of notable exhibitions, including Tropical, Stories from Southeast Asia and Latin America, Georgette Chen, At Home at the World, and Lim Cheng Ho, Painting Singapore in 2018. Following Hui Min, we will hear from Roy Ng, who will present Photographic Others, Deconstructing the Exotic in Interwar Paris. His research uncovers how photography both shaped and challenged the image of the Asian other in interwar Paris, probing the visual politics of colonial representation and revealing the layered narratives behind the lens. Roy is assistant curator at the gallery. His research takes a material and transhistorical approach to photography, particularly in Southeast Asia. From ancestral halls in Straits Chinese communities to contemporary photographic archives in Myanmar, Roy's work explores how photography intersects with identity, memory, and power. He was on the curatorial teams of several major exhibitions, including Living Pictures, Photography in Southeast Asia, Namjung Pike, The Future is Now, and of course, City of Others. He holds a Master of Studies in Art History and Visual Culture from the University of Oxford. So without further ado, I will invite Hui Min on stage to give us the first presentation.
Thank you, Adele, and good morning, everyone. So I want to start today's presentation with this image, which is of a popular tourist map for Paris and is dated to the 1930s and carries the subtitle, Practical Itinerary for Foreigners in Paris. It is perhaps to our contemporary eye quite startlingly familiar in both shape and form, right? The kind of structure, curving outline of the Seine, moving through the city, clusters of architectural landmarks spreading across the rational design of broad boulevards and tightly clustered districts. At the same time, it's also overwhelming in its detail and no lack of landmarks. How practical, we must ask, would a map like this really be for the Asian artist in Paris? The idea of Paris and the representation of its streets and districts had by the 1920s been thoroughly recorded and circulated through maps such as this one. And it had also by that time become almost synonymous with an understanding of the modern city, the metropolis, and the experience of modern life. We recall Charles Baudelaire's flaneur, the detached yet meticulously engaged observer who drifts through the crowd, attuned to the fleeting but wondrous activity of everyday life. The idea of the city, wandering it, capturing it, also became intimately tied to the production of art and indeed the figure of the modern artist who, through his works, could capture that affect of modernity. And yet, for the Asian artist, arriving in Paris between the 1920s and 40s, the city was known and unknown. Carrying their identities of otherness, they could not necessarily disappear into the crowd. Their engagements with the city posed questions about the positionality of the artist as observer. How did they navigate the city? How did they make it legible to themselves and to others? For many Asian artists, the circulation of the city was determined by a sense of intentionality. They studied at specific academies, had preferences for salons, as Phoebe mentioned, and they recorded the city for themselves and their contemporaries back home, literally and also figuratively, making it accessible through their art, but also guidebooks, artist-made maps, and personal reflections. Here is the cover of Nakamura Sueno's Artistic Itinerary of Paris, published in 1934. While still very rich in detail, the map on the book's cover redraws Paris for the specific audience of the Japanese visitor who had particular goals for artistic exposure. The map emphasizes, above all other landmarks, the museums available in the city. Although these remain annotated in English, the book itself includes instructional chapters in Japanese, focusing on topics such as art schools in Paris, notes on the districts of Montmartre and Montparnasse, practical notes on artist models in Paris, and of course, descriptions of museum collections. Here we see the city distilled even further. This is a map by Wang Ziyun, a Chinese artist who lived in Paris from 1930 to 1937. The map was published in a Chinese language periodical, Yifeng, where it was circulated as part of an extended essay by the artist, providing an overview of European modern art. Wang pares down Paris to its essentials, reducing it to several key locations, each with purpose. It charts where to live, Montmartre or Montparnasse, where to study, the École des Beaux-Arts, where he himself was enrolled as a student, where to absorb French history and art at the Louvre and other historical landmarks, and where to exhibit at the annual salons held in the Grand Palais. This is not so much a map, but really more a diagram, tailored to the specific needs of artistic orientation. This example of agency to redraw and reprioritize sites for fellow Asian artists made Paris more legible and accessible, almost like it was providing a shorthand, a guide where they should focus their attention in order to live, learn, look, and be seen. For the Chinese artist Liu Haisu, his time in France and Europe was mapped in the form of textual reflections about the state of artistic development in Europe. Liu's essays move fluidly between personal observation, art criticism, and cultural commentary. This was not only intended for fellow Chinese artists, but also a broader Chinese readership. Liu's recollections reveal an acute awareness that being in Paris as an Asian artist was not just a private experience, it was also in many ways representative. Liu carried with him a sense of responsibility almost to absorb, assess, and articulate the state of European art for readers back home. Here is another example, published in 1929, Profile of Paris by the Japanese artist Fujita Suguharu, which proposes slightly different sensibility, as someone who had by then already deeply embedded himself in the city's artistic fabric. Unlike Liu Haisu, who had spent about 2 years in Paris and Europe before returning to Shanghai, Fujita had, by the time of this book's publishing, spent over a decade resident in the capital. The representation of Paris on the book's cover is not a map, nor an emphasis on textual recording. It is a stylized play on the book's title, Profile of Paris, the city personified through Fujita's subjective application of line, his prominent signature on the cover underscoring the centrality of his perspective on the city. This was not just about recording various aspects of Paris, but perhaps also him staking his own claim and position within it. So these rooted and contextual examples of translating the city speak of a certain clarity of goals as well as ambition for the Asian artists who came to Paris, and this also informed the way in which our curatorial team conceived the exhibition as focusing on a series of zones of activity. This approach allowed us to center our research on the experience of the Asian artists in Paris, including spaces of colonial exhibition and displays, the ateliers which marked the expansion of the Art Deco movement, spaces of entertainment which hosted dancers from Asia, main sites where artists displayed their works, and of course where they chose to reside and set up their studios. So today I'll be sharing a bit more about some findings and I think questions which still remain open, which really emerge through this framework, in order to consider how spaces of encounter and circulation can potentially provide new insights into the way Asian artists both inscribed and produce the city through their art. So this is just a snapshot of our working document, and I think a really prime place to really acknowledge the joint effort of the curatorial team in compiling all the addresses of studios, ateliers, and also exhibition sites of commercial galleries. So this is a slightly zoomed in view, which includes the area of Montparnasse and its surrounding environs, where many of the studios and residences of Asian artists were located. The loose borders of Montparnasse can be defined as occupying parts of the 6th, 14th, and 15th arrondissement, which is indicated roughly in the center of this view. So it also includes some of the surrounding areas, showing how Montparnasse was really grounded by a number of independent academies and the outward spiraling of artists' residences. Drawn by affordable rental and a proximity to these academies, the area became a hub for a diverse milieu that included artists from all over the world. This is where artists like Fujita Sugiharu established their studios and maintained also social worlds alongside other migrant artists from other parts of Europe and elsewhere, including Moishe Kissling, Gies van Dongen, and Amadeo Modigliani. This is quite dense, but there are several interesting things to point out. So there's a certain proximity of studios with some interesting overlaps, such as Fujita's residence in 1915, which was subsequently occupied by Shimizu Toshi, which was also on the same street as Hamanaka Katsu's studio, which he opened in 1924 on the city Falguière. The intersection is also interesting between conventional so-called painter-artist studios and residences, as well as Art Deco ateliers, including Jean Dunant's. So you really see this place as a really key nexus of activity. So one of the early questions of our exhibition project was to really think about whether or not there were meaningful exchanges across communities of Asian artists in Paris, which tended to have been studied along national lines. I must say that these connections still remain as an area requiring further research, but the points laid out on this map are an attractive invitation to consider how proximity might have engendered encounters, whether passing or felt, along spaces like cafes, schools, neighborhood streets, where Asian artists circulated and lived. What is not captured here are the various dates of stay for the artists, which is included in our exhibition catalogue, but that of course provides another layer for consideration. And also the scope of names that we included in our research are necessarily defined by the artists that we have chosen to represent in the show. So coming back to what I was sharing earlier about one of the most important spaces which grounded Montparnasse for artists is really the concentration of independent academies, including the Grand Chaumière, where artists including Pan Yuliang, Seiki Yuzo, Liu Haisu, Liu Kang, and Chen Renhao attended. Academy Ranson, Modern, and André Lhote were especially popular with Japanese artists, alongside Academy Colarossi and Academy Julian, which were all nearby. This photograph of Chinese artists Liu Kang and Chen Renhao outside the Grand Chaumière with fellow classmates suggests these sites not just as places for learning, but also encounter and acquaintance. A cross-referencing of periods and schools attended by Asian artists might yet yield more possible connections. So of course, this also led many of the artists to set up their studios, which also played host, right, to different types of social encounters as well. But the city and its districts were not just places of residence and work. They also became, of course, important subjects for Asian artists to express their experiences of the city. On the left, we have a painting titled Place Maubert by Yun Ji, painted during his first sojourn in Paris. The winding street, exaggerated curves, distortion of the visual plane, rendered in rhythmic, undulating lines, suggests an experience of the city that is intensely felt and disconcerting. On the right, we have Paris at Night by Shimizu Toshi. Here, the mood is darker, the geometry harder and more resolute. The figures are stylized within a theatrically lit composition, and a religious figure walks through the scene, contrasting against those who occupy the margins and background. The comparison across these two works, and certainly across many of the other street scenes, reminds us that to walk Paris is not to see the same thing. And yet, the geographic specificity of each painting's location, Place Maubert for Yunji, and this very particular street corner of Boulevard Pasteur and Rue Falguière in Shimizu Toshi's painting, indicate a certain surety and confidence of emplacement within the city. These artists assert their presence. We were here. These were not just imagined spaces, they were claims of presence and presentations of their own subjective perceptions. Of course, not all artists chose to insert themselves fully into the heart of Montparnasse and the bustling activity. The experience of living and working in Paris could often be quite different, depending on means, networks, and access. So Liu Kang and Chen Renhao were two Chinese artists who had been classmates at the Shanghai Academy of Art, arrived in 1929 in Paris, where they proceeded to find accommodations actually quite far out in an area called Fontenay-et-Rosé. And this was also the residence where Liu Haisu, their former teacher, would join them later that same year. Following some travel around Europe, Liu Kang and Chen Renhao would then move to a pensione along the eastern fringes of Paris in Nogent-sur-Marne from 1930 until their departure in 1932. During this time, Liu Haisu took up residence in one of the halls in Sorbonne University. Notably, and you'll see that in the archival fragment below, Liu Kang and Chen Renhao actually adopted Liu Haisu's more prestigious address as their own in entries for the Salon de Tom, perhaps suggesting a certain hierarchy regarding the locales of residence for artists. So the movement of artists in and out of the city's different districts over time is also a really interesting and potential area for comparison. Beyond their physical residences and places of circulation, another key zone of presence for the Asian artists were in, of course, the sites where their art was displayed. Clustered along both banks of the Seine were core venues of artistic display. As this map shows you, the density of these venues highlights a certain strategic centrality of the Seine corridor, a place where museums, galleries, salons, and monuments converged, and where the presence of the Asian artists became visible. Many commercial galleries where Asian artists found representation were also sited in this corridor and were much more than just places or institutions. They formed almost like a symbolic spine for artists to navigate both commercial and cultural legitimacy. But their presence at these sites was more than just about the display of their art. The Salon de Tom, held in the halls of the Grand Palais, was a major venue for exhibition for Asian artists in the period. This was a site of visibility in more ways than one. Opening the door to critics, buyers, future exhibitions, and a successful professional career, it was also where Asian artists could come to observe each other. Liu Kang's copy of the Salon de Tom catalogue indicates underlines in red of names of Japanese artists and also other artists he admired, including Van Dongen, which you see here. It was also where he would meet fellow Chinese artist Georgette Chen for the first time as a fellow exhibitor in the 1930 Salon de Tom. The pair would reconnect much later in Singapore, where they would both eventually migrate, Chen seeking Liu's assistance to rent a home after her move here. As such, by following these traces and moments of intersection, these sites of display were as much as they were about encounters as they were about display. So I want to turn to a final site at a particular point in time, which is the 1931 International Colonial Exposition. The exposition brought with it its own proliferation of maps and proposed ways of navigating its sprawling site. Located on the eastern fringes of Paris in the Bois de Vincennes, the exposition was visited by over 6 million people and offered what was described as a tour through the world. Maps of the exposition focused on colonial pavilions as key points of interest, transposing the global colonial map onto Paris. Amongst the elaborate pavilions in this condensed articulation of the imperial world was the replica of Angkor Wat, which housed the pavilion of Indochina. Within this spectacle of the exotic, constructed for colonial consumption, was a display of art from Vietnamese artists, which Phoebe kindly gave us an overview of earlier. Through works in silk, lacquer, and paintings, such as the one that we see here, exposition visitors were invited to explore, and through the art and objects on display, visit the distant colonies. The colony and its subjects, seemingly at peace, lush, sanitized landscapes were put on display. These windows into the colonies within the simulacra of grand architectural pavilions transformed the art and artists displayed into new landmarks in the city, which in turn made real the expansive cartographies of global colonial expansion. Yet the exposition was also a site of encounter for the Asian artists, where they could also be spectators and observers of life in colonial sites. Liu Kang, for instance, visited while in Paris between 29 and 32. This is his little pocket-sized map, which he kept in his personal archive, alongside a dazzling array of postcards, which you see in the top left, which reveal a certain fascination with these displays of colonial curiosity. It is likely that Liu visited the Netherlands Pavilion, and this was possibly his first encounter with the culture of Bali and Java. This moment of exposure would resurface later in a significant way. In 1952, Liu would himself travel to Bali and Java, where he personally met Jagoda Gede Raka Sukawati, the very choreographer for the dance contingent for Bali at the 1931 exposition. Liu's fascination with the culture of Bali, as presented in this colonial setting, arguably persisted, emerging in the presentation of his subjects in the paintings created following his trip in the 1950s. While these later depictions of Bali reflected his own evolving artistic style and subjective interpretations, the early encounter in 1931 proposes a consideration of how colonial framings of the other, constructed for spectacle, could continue to reverberate across time. So coming back to this overview of this map, which through our research we tried to make legible, really through the perspective of the Asian artists, I want to close on some points for reflection. Because the varied tenures of the Asian artists in Paris also meant that many of these connections were fleeting, itinerant, formed in cafes, through guidebooks, rented rooms, and public exhibitions. And what I've shared today really remains very speculative and open in many areas, and certainly not exhaustive. But it's hoped that in following these artists through a trail of addresses and spaces of display, that perhaps we can begin to think differently about what it might mean to belong and reside in a place, not necessarily through permanence, but through records of presence and encounters, which inscribe the city, however briefly, with new perspectives of seeing and being seen. Thank you.
Thank you, Hui Min. And next up, we have Roy Hung with Photographic Others.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. Huge thanks also to the curatorial programs team for organizing this symposium, and to the rest of the curators who have been such wonderful teammates over the past 5 years working on this exhibition. Today, I'll be exploring how photography, often perceived as a medium of objective documentation, played a pivotal role in both constructing and disrupting notions of the exotic in interwar Paris. I'll begin by examining how photography was entangled with the visual economies of empire, where images of the colonies were circulated, aestheticized, and deployed as surrogate signs of native authenticity. Yet these visual systems, while cloaked in the supposed authenticity, supposed neutrality of the camera, reveal internal contradictions, producing ambiguities and cultural slippages. Within the cosmopolitan environment of Paris, photography became a performative space for mimicry, performance, and subversion. Wilfredo Lum, for one, appropriated Afro-Cuban visual codes to disrupt the surrealist fetishization of non-Western art, particularly as seen in Man Ray's photos. Similarly, Umrao Singh Shergill, the Indian aristocrat, Indologist, philosopher, and photographer whose researches, like Shanae Javeri, explored in his dissertation, and which my work built upon, was engaged in a visual dialogue with his daughter, Emeritus Shergill. So through Umrao's lens and Emeritus' brush, each navigated these hybrid identities across respective personal and cultural registers. So we'll see later these artists oscillating between intimacy and estrangement, really exposing perhaps the ambivalence of the colonial gaze, but also destabilizing these binary notions of self and other. And in a way, photography emerges not just as a passive document of empire, but really a kind of a side of instability, where subjectivity fractures, multiplies, and resists containment. Allow me to first set a bit of context, drawing from references around the City of Others exhibition. For those who visited the show, you've seen works pertaining to the 1931 Colonial Exposition in Paris. As much as we've established in our show how the exposition orchestrated this vision of imperial fantasy, central to this was really the use of these mass-circulated photographic references from the colonies, which provided a visual reservoir from which artists drew inspiration. In the Palais de la Porte Dorée, Alfred Janot's monumental bas-reliefs transformed archaeological documentation of Angkor Wat's friezes from photographs into stylized allegories of colonial bounty. Similarly, the Indochina Pavilion, which is, as Phoebe has established, a near life-size replica of Angkor Wat, exemplified how photography's neutralizing effects enabled the transplanting of architectural features from sacred space to colonial spectacle. Artists and architects preferred the photograph not for its interpretive richness, but also as for its utility as an index of control, deploying it to curate a sanitized, dehistoricized vision of the East for visual consumption. Photography underwrote a system of manufactured authenticity, a colonial imaginary that neutralized cultural complexity in favor of visual legibility and imperial mastery. Marie-Antoinette Boulard-Devé's frieze inside the Indochina Pavilion further exemplifies this photographic logic, likely drawn from field sketches and photographs collected during and after her travels in Indochina in the 1920s. Her work classifies and essentializes colonial subjects into visual archetypes. These are brightly adorned, exoticized, and decontextualized on the canvas. The frieze, gilded surfaces, and stage typologies enact a form of possession where the Hmong communities across Vietnam and Laos were represented not as historical agents, but timeless specimens sequestered in awkward ethnographic poses and suspended in a tableau vivant for the Western gaze. Man Ray's stylized portraits featuring dances of Martinican and Guadeloupean descent, Simon Luz, Aisha Goblet, and his partner, Adrien Fidelin, also reveal the colonial gaze embedded in photography. And this is also kind of building off some of the performance documentation of dances in a section in our show. For the image of Fidelin on the right of this slide, she appears bare-chested under the sun, shielding her torso with a washboard that evokes a grass skirt, a shield, or a mermaid's tail. To borrow Wendy Grossman's assessment, Fidelin embodied the trope of the venue noir, a racialized, sexualized figure caught between the primitive and the modern in the European imagination. Her role in the French visual culture echoed long-standing narratives that fetishized Black femininity. In Man Ray's Mort de Congo series, Fidelin is shown in Congolese headdresses, bare-shouldered and adorned with a tooth necklace and ivory bangles, posing to accentuate her racial otherness. A full-page spread in the 1937 Harper's Bazaar framed her as the archetypal African native, aligning her image with the article's headline, "The Bashongo of Africa Sends His Hats to Paris." The visual rhetoric not only projected difference but also folded Fidelin into a homogenizing notion of blackness, set in stark contrast to the white models similarly styled on the opposing page. Yet, while photography undoubtedly served the visual economies of empire, it also allowed representation to operate within a more unstable symbolic terrain. However imposing the camera's lens may be, the rhetoric of colonial knowledge appears to be entangled in a more complex network of power, inflected by heterogeneous practices that run even against the most oppressive forms of cultural representation and appropriation. If I may quote Michel de Certeau, there is a polytheism of concealed or disseminated practices, perceived and enacted through the fields of symbolism and meaning that are often densely conflicted and contradictory, so long as the inconsistencies of human agency are active. We see this tension coming through quite clearly in the visual dialogue between Man Ray and Wilfredo Lam, the latter of Cuban artists of mixed heritage, of Chinese, African, and Spanish descent, whose transnational trajectory underscore Man Ray's own ambivalent and often contradictory intersections of primitivism and surrealism. Man Ray's studio portraits of white women alongside African and Austronesian sculptures, as you can see on this slide, marked by dramatic lighting and erotic gestures and juxtapositions, simultaneously participate in and critique the fetishistic gaze that defined Western modernism's relationship with the non-West. By portraying the white woman as seemingly captivated by the African objects, Man Ray subverts the typical colonial dynamic, which more often positions the non-Western female body as the object of white male desire. Yet this inversion remains fraught, as it still operates within a dialectic that essentializes Africa as sexual access and commercial possession. Although vocally denouncing colonialism as following a logic of capital, the surrealists actively participated in the art market, buying, reselling, and speculating on non-Western artifacts, often through dealers advertising in their own publication. The surrealist poet Louis Aragon even boasted of acquiring top pieces for their counter-exhibition to the 1931 Colonial Exposition. Lam, who was both an inheritor and interlocutor to such primitivism during his time in Paris, seized on this ambivalence and restructured the visual codes deployed by artists like Man Ray and their fascination with the other. The portrayal of a grieving Spanish woman in Lillette in our exhibition, as you can see on the right of this slide, for instance, demonstrates contextually Lam's experiences in the Spanish Civil War, in which he fought before arriving in Paris in 1938, but also the preponderance of modernism's use of African aesthetics, from which he started revisiting his own intimate knowledge of Afro-Cuban culture. The mask-like appearance of the subject's face, with its features reduced to no more than a few geometrical lines, affirms an expressionist mode of dramatization, where through the medium of painting he muddies photography's indexicality and inserts within them a form of ambiguity that refuses to be contained. While masks in Man Ray's photos are a subject of intrigue precisely because they operate as foils for white performance in symbolizing the concealment and inaccessibility of one's true, perhaps elusive self, Lam turns faces into masks insofar as they become tools of revelation, animating them from within and reflecting the spatial dislocations of Afro-Cuban heritage, animating them from within and imbuing his subject with interiority and disquiet. It is tempting to think that while reflecting the spatial dislocations of Afro-Cuban heritage, he used this idiosyncratic interpretive spin to ponder more deeply about the asymmetrical power relations that emerged even within surrealism. As much as Lam's strategy fractured the exoticizing lens of photography through painted expressions, Umral Singh Shagil adopts a quieter, introspective mode of resistance, using photography to reclaim his and his family's subjectivities through sustained self-inquiry. The Shagil photographic archive, spanning over 3,000 vintage prints, negatives, and autochromes, much of which were not published or exhibited in his lifetime, is a personal chronicle as much as it is a sustained meditation on their cosmopolitan identities. A key highlight in the archive features Umral's daughter Amrita, who, as we know, emerged as a modernist of international stature and now stands at the apex of Indian modern art. Amrita's life and artistic trajectory, marked by her education at the École des Beaux-Arts and the Académie de la Grande Chaumière in Paris from 1929 to 1933, and a return to India in 1935 in what was a short but prolific career, are vividly captured through the lens of her father. We see his experimentation with photographic techniques at play, portraying her corporeal presence with spectral others, split using mirrors and multiple exposure shots. While art critic Geeta Kapoor observes that Emeritus modernism wrestled with a fragmented self formed through cross-cultural displacement, it was her father's photos that animated that search with the verisimilitude of the medium. Murrell's photographs of Amrita played a crucial role not only in informing her artistic sensibility, but also in shaping her evolving identity, as he used the camera to understand her both as an artist and his daughter. His images resonate with Kapur's assessments of Amrita, and I quote, "This was not role-playing, but rather the reflex of a divided subject, who was nevertheless at ease with her Indo-European extraction, a flamboyant presence seen through sumptuous saris and Indian jewelry she had taken to wearing." Murrell's self-portraits reveal a similarly layered consciousness. With magnifying glasses, typewriters, and books, he projects an erudition comparable not only to his aristocratic origins, but also to one who has made his entry into the world of the Central European bourgeoisie, focusing his lens on the trappings that furnished a certain idea of the decorum of the enlightened classes. Emulating the polymath Rabindranath Tagore's sartorial style by letting his hair down and dressing himself with a chapkan, which is a loose overcoat worn over a tunic, he is seen here as formulating a kind of confluential thinking, with an appearance that did not seek to nativize or assert foreigners, but instead to negotiate a global consciousness through intimate indicators of self. While Murrell might not have been part of the established literary groups of Punjab, he counted among his friends in the early 1900s the future editor of the East and West magazine, Joginder Singh, and the philanthropist and educationist Jalaluddin Mirza. He also developed a close camaraderie with the philosopher-poet Allama Muhammad Iqbal, who, though is most remembered for his involvement in the formation of Pakistan, was very much a product of his education in Germany, where he familiarized himself with the various philosophical traditions of Europe. Friedrich Nietzsche and Henry Bergson, in particular, dominated both men's imagination, who were drawn to concepts like Amor Fati and Elan Vital. Regardless of where Iqbal's political vision led in the 1930s, his notions of universalism, articulated through poetry, bear affinity with some of Shergill's sentiments in later life. The artist-scholar Vivan Sundaram, who happens to be the grandson of Murrell, sees this cultural navigation as taking shape as early as 1889 through this group portrait of Shergill's clan in Lahore. He describes how the camera is placed off-center and, as if by the sleight of hand, Murrell Singh is brought nearer to the lens, foregrounding him in a highly mannered pose. A dandy, he is without his turban, his torso is bare, he shows his bare legs and his feet, shod in white socks. Murrell Singh shoots his family and the retinue to show its difference, his attitude. The origins of a westernized, cultivated self are even more apparent in some self-portraits dating from 1892 to 1908. This image of 1982, for instance, shows the 22-year-old youth, Murrell here, in a voluminous dressing gown, seated at his desk and engrossed in the book he holds in his hand. With these early images, Murrell undertakes the project of elevating and dignifying the Indian subject, offering it a sense of presence and agency largely denied in colonial visual discourse, and doing so with quiet assurance and poise. As intimate statements of purpose, these photos assert the self, the I is worthy of recognition and seriousness. In a way, Murrell approaches self-representation with reflexivity and gravitas, crafting an identity that consciously sets him apart from other male members of his family. Subsequently stranded in Hungary during World War I, Murrell's self-portraits increasingly featured visual cues with elaborate clothing, books, and introspective poses that asserted his identity as a learned, cosmopolitan gentleman, shaped by both South Asian and European traditions. For the images on the left and the top of this slide, he appears sporting a European haircut, holding a book or clutching a shawl with his eyes closed. For another photo on the bottom, he turned outward, capturing himself in various guises: a suited patriarch, a reclining figure in Indian dress, a hybrid Russian intellectual, a Tolstoyan peasant, or an Oriental sage donning a turban and resting on a divan. These shifting portrayals, Sundaram notes, suggests that the person Sergio projects is that of a pictorial being issuing from a tableau. There is a conscious engagement with the fruitful tensions that arise from straddling diverse intellectual and philosophical traditions, and with what it means to live within those overlapping frameworks. The inner ambivalence surfaces in a 1916 letter, where Umrao confesses, and I quote, "I sometimes wish I were an Englishman and not Indian, whose nation is oppressed by the English. But I loathe to belong to a nation of oppress, and I am after all content to remain an Indian in spite of what has come. The more I see life in Europe, the better I like my own country." By the time the Sergios arrived in Paris in 1929, Umrao has already identified himself with a pluralistic form of self-presentation. In one photographic series from 1930, he appears wearing only a loincloth, shown before and after completing a 15-day fast, while signaling a form of asceticism. And he presents himself here, firmly within the interiors of his luxurious residence in the Latin Quarter of Paris. These images do more than record physical transformation. They perform an identity shaped by lifestyle choices such as fasting and vegetarianism, not as ends in themselves, but as acts of cultural positioning within an overtly European milieu. Sergio's self-presentation of restrained discipline resonates with Gandhi's concept of the path of the yogi, a life shaped less by public activism than by subtle resistance through personal ethical resolve. Umrao, who was inspired by Gandhi, saw yogic ethics as part of this broader transnational project of cultural renewal, one that's facilitated by a kind of modernity predicated on ongoing dialogue across traditions in Asia and Europe. As he writes, and I quote, "Yogic ethics survives only in the East, and to learn it we have to turn to the East. But we need qualified interpreters for the terms and symbols of Western thought." This ethos informed Amrita as well. Her work, influenced by post-impressionists like Gauguin and Van Gogh, yet critical of it, developed a modernist idiom attuned to the contradictions inherent to her otherness in Paris. In Woman Wearing Shawl, the painting we are displaying in our exhibition, she portrays a Romani or Hungarian figure with quiet resilience, her red shawl performative of cultural difference. Art historian Saloni Martha sees in Amrita's art not a reconciliation with origins, but a surface-bearing existential unsettlement, and the aching but seemingly interminable search for the solidity and satisfaction of earth. Her practice parallels Umrao's, both cultivating and coming to terms with their exilic hybrid selves through portraiture, and this is also shown in a letter to her father in 1934, where she explains her reason for returning to India, and I quote, "Our long stay in Europe has aided me to discover, as it were, India. It seems paradoxical, but I know for certain that we had not come away to Europe. I should perhaps never have realized that a fresco from Ajanta or a small piece of sculpture in the Musée Cernuschi is worth more than the whole Renaissance," unquote. Correspondingly, in 1940, Umrao writes to Amrita, and he says, "The camera eye, I discerned only what was within the familial realm, and perhaps this realm was in the process of being breached. Transgression through Umrao's eyes is perhaps a facet of his ongoing engagement with the multiple aesthetic and ideological foundations of a more global modernism, an engagement that Amrita too as she slips into and between the interstices of culture amidst these uncertain coordinates of a decolonizing world. And if I may conclude, photography's reproductive logic, really in its capacity to index, repeat, and circulate, fed the Western impulse to see the world through visual taxonomies and to make other subjects do the same. But these, with each repetition came slippages, excess meanings that fractured colonial categories and disrupt their authority. In this unstable terrain, photography shifts from a tool of verification to a performative side of contestation, where meaning is destabilized, science fragments, and the Western lens is exposed as being riddled with aporia. Through Lam's counter-primitivism and de Churgill's forms of self-fashioning, we see how this vision is deconstructed, revealing its contradictions and allowing space for ambiguity, ambivalence, and the unruly emergence of selves that refuse to be contained. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Roy. Thank you. That was actually an interesting juxtaposition for me, the outside to the inside, right? So just to kick us off, I have a question about what Hui Min initially also mentioned about fleeting relationships, right, that you were also trying to map. But I was also curious about what endured, or were some of the enduring relationships that were formed in Paris, and also photography's role in capturing those relationships. Yeah, I'm just wondering if you both might respond to that.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you, Adele. I think that's a great question because I think the question of what endured was something really important for the Asian artists. I think through some of these records, like Liu Haisu's kind of compilation, it was really, I think they had a certain sense of history, that they were there to do something very important, which was to, in many ways, launch their careers as professional artists, further their studies. And for many of these artists, the Paris or European moment became a very important marker on their CVs, as they were. But in terms of kind of personal relationships which endured, there are many interesting case studies. So for example, Georgette Chen, whom Phoebe brought up in this morning's presentation, continued to have a long-term kind of written relationship with her fellow classmate, Roger Chaplin-Midi, even after she came back to Singapore. So as both students of Picard Ledoux, they really, kind of connected with each other. And after coming back to Singapore, she would recommend her students at the Academy of Fine Art in Singapore to further their education in the École des Beaux-Arts, where Roger Chaplin-Midi had become a teacher. So this kind of continuation of relationship is something that is really, I think, born out of this Paris moment, and that's just one example. Yeah, and I think for photography as well, I think you saw a little glimpse of in Liu Haisu's manuscript, the incredible heroic photograph of himself with Liu Kang, his student, which we have a wonderful display of in the exhibition as well. And I think it really played into that notion of self-fashioning, precisely as Roy mentioned.
Yeah, just, obviously just looking at photography's sort of immortalizing gaze, right? You're actually capturing something for perpetuity, and it lasts as long as the reproduction of that image sustains itself, right? So this can be seen, obviously, from the colonial examples that I shared earlier, but also the personal relationships, the image of Amrita that's so striking, that's captured by Umrao, it survives, and we have records with verisimilitude of the actual portraits, how Amrita essentially looks, and we can kind of find a kind of both resonance, but also a conversation across two types of medium, painting and photography, and also the kind of visual slippages that's afforded by photography, and also how the painting as a medium kind of muddies that indexicality. And so I think, it's an interesting conversation to be had across not just the two artists themselves, but also the kind of interactions, intermediate interactions across maybe both father and daughter, but also for the case, maybe just thinking about Wilfredo Lam and Man Ray, right? The fact that these African or Austronesian sculptures are also represented and documented in such a way that also tries to, there's an objectifying lens of the camera, right? And it sort of possesses the object within the surface of the print. But then again, there is a kind of conversation that's been made with Wilfredo as an interlocutor, but also an inheritor of that surrealist sort of circle that he was operating within. So, yeah.
I'm also curious how widely was photography used, with the artist that you were surveying in the exhibition?
Yeah, I think in terms of archiving and recording, it was quite important. So Liu Kang himself was an avid photographer and recorded to minutia, all the places they visited, all the museums, people, studios that they met as a kind of visual diary, which has been spoken about. And yeah, I think even in Fujita's publication, he included photos of himself in his studio, painting with models. And there's a wonderful collection of some of his photographs as well in the exhibition, which again, it's quite playful. The way in which he was also positioning himself within Paris. So I think it was both a form of recording, but also self-fashioning.
I'd like to open the floor now to questions. There's a gentleman over there.
I thank you for the great talk. Roy, I have a question for you, which is quite specific on Wilfredo Lam. Looking at the piece that you've shown, that artwork, how does it show that it is or how is it interpreted as a piece of artwork that decolonizes or decolonization of piece of decolonization artwork? The other thing is that Wilfredo Lam uses this term that he says that he uses his art as a Trojan horse to penetrate the world of the exploiters. Could you help, elaborate and give us more things about that? Thank you.
Thank you for that. I'm also just thinking about his positionality as Chinese-Cuban artist, right? With his descent from, he has Chinese, Spanish, and African descent. So his place and his positionality within Paris is interesting. And I think there is a kind of contrast to be made against Man Ray's photos, which, there are these images of, white women being juxtaposed against masks or artifacts from the non-West, but they also often serve as kind of foils to serve a kind of foil to white Western sort of identities, in a way. So there is an interesting kind of negotiation between that, and if you compare it with Wilfredo Lam, the mask is sort of worn, right? It's sort of a kind of facial expression that comes through with a kind of interiority or disquiet that isn't the same as photography, which is a little bit more static in that regard. So the idea of a Trojan horse, right? The painting itself, again, just muddies the certainties that are associated with photography and also the objectifying gazes that's associated with photography. I just find that quite interesting in that regard, that while he is very much also an inheritor of the surrealist movement, but at the same time, he's also a kind of critical interlocutor, commenting and reflecting and also sort of inverting the dialectics that's often associated with, surrealism, which obviously is also fraught with these sort of colonial sort of predispositions.
I think it's interesting question to think about the evolution of the artist's engagement with some of these sources, kind of cultural sources. So for Wilfredo Lam, I think the idea of the Trojan horse and this kind of very strong stance of the decolonial was also something that evolved over time. And, at the beginning, this really interesting point in time, he was really part of that kind of milieu with Picasso as well. And I think really having a very vibrant exchange with Picasso and the way in which Picasso was using some of these references, which Lam himself was discovering/rediscovering for himself. And the kind of return to Cuba in a later part of his life really brought through this reconnection with his Santeria religion, this kind of syncretic Afro-Cuban Catholicism, which re-imbued some of these kind of visual references in his art. So I think it's kind of interesting to think about how the positionality of the artist also shifts vis-a-vis the kind of choices of kind of sources of representation in their art.
Any other question? A lady over there.
Hello. Thank you so much for your presentations. I was curious to hear more about, I think you mentioned at the end of your mapping presentation about how the sort of like the universal expositions influenced Liu Kang, and then later on in his travels to Bali, you sort of saw that like exotic gaze being presented in his paintings, and I was curious if there were other Asian artists who were influenced by the universal expositions in the same way.
So thank you for that question. I think it's also to kind of understand that the question of influence and inspiration is not always so direct, and I think Liu Kang had a wealth of other kind of resources that he encountered, following the 1931 exposition as well. He was very widely read, and I think he was also responding to a much broader, extensive history of artists in general who used kind of travel to kind of so-called other exotic locations as a means to reinvigorate their art. And it wasn't just Asian artists like Liu Kang. Famously earlier, Gauguin had attended the Universal Exposition where he saw for the first time, the recreation of Tahitian huts and so on, which really sparked off that desire and an urge to travel to those locales. So it was, and I would say not just artists, writers, poets, thinkers, these kind of the kind of cartography of the Universal Exposition or colonial expositions really, I think, translated and transported the notion of colonial cataloging and certain very particular ways of framing and looking in this way that would reverberate across the centuries. So it's so interesting to then look at Liu Kang's kind of so-called 1952 Bali Java moment and to think back and really tease out all the different sources and ideas that led him to this point, and which he has, in his own way and through his own artistic subjectivity, then translated into his art. Not so much in a direct way, but as I said, through these kind of moments of encounter, along the way.
Please join me in thanking Hui Min and Roy.